Okay, so in this program we are going to look at variables, data types, and operators. So we're going to make a program that simply takes a couple of numbers from the user and adds, subtracts, multiplies, divides those numbers, and we'll look at modulus. So I'm just putting a comment at the top of the program that says this program performs arithmetic operations on integers given by the user. Okay, so I need my include IO stream because I'm going to be sending some output to the monitor and get some input from the keyboard, and I need my using namespace standard. Then I write the structure for my main program. So I've got a void main void, starts with the curly bracket and always ends with the curly bracket. Again, I always put those two brackets in at the same time, and then I just mouse up and give myself some space to add lines in between those two brackets. That way I never forget to put the closing bracket. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is declare some variables, and I have to think about what type of variables I need. So remember, variables are memory locations where we're storing data, and we need the type of that data and then a name so that we can refer to this data in the program. So I'm going to get the user to enter integers, and remember, integers are numbers that don't have any decimal places. So I'm just going to say num1 and num2. Then I need some variables to hold the results of my operation. So if I'm adding or subtracting two integers, I'm going to get another integer. So I could say integer add result and subtract result, and that would make sense. But if and actually same with multiply, I'm still going to get an integer. So multiply, I'll just say product. Okay, so but if I'm going to divide the two numbers, I could end up with a fractional result. So I'm going to have to store that in a type of variable that can hold a number that has a decimal point. And one of those, there's more than one type, but float is the type that I'm going to use here. So when I say float, that is a variable type that can hold a number that has a decimal point. So I'm going to give it a name. I'll just say division result. Okay, so now I've declared all my variables. Before I can use num1 and num2 in any equations, they're going to have values, and I'm going to get those values from the user. So I'm going to say cout, enter a value, enter an integer value for the first number. And don't forget your semicolon at the end. And then I'm going to wait for them to enter that number, and I'm going to save that in variable num1. I'm going to do the same thing to get a value for num2. And that would be the second number. second number. Okay, and at this point I want to test it just to make sure that the program runs before I get too far. So let's just run that. Okay, so the program says enter an integer value for the first number. I'm going to enter 3 and then 5, and I know what's going to happen next. I didn't put a system pause, so this window is going to close right away, and it does. So that's because I forgot to put a system pause at the end of my program to say keep that window open. So if I run it again, the window should stay open this time. And it does. So nothing else happened, it just let us enter our numbers because that's the only thing we've told it to do so far. So that works, and I'm going to close that and go back to typing the rest of my program. So let me add a comment on top of this that we're asking the user to enter values for num1 and num2. I should not have a space there. Okay, so this essentially initializes num1 and num2, which means giving num1 and 2 a value. Because before we can use them in any equation, they have to have a value. So now I'm going to write a comment here that we're going to perform calculations. And then further down, I'm going to want to display the results. Okay, so the first calculation I'm going to perform is I'm going to get the value of add result from num1 plus num2 using the add operator, which in C++ is this number sign, just the plus sign symbol. The equal sign is the assignment operator. Remember, whatever variable is on the left, in this case add result, that's the variable that is getting the value, and it's getting the value from this equation which says num1 plus num2. So it should be whatever num1 plus num2 is. And in order for us to see that, we're going to have to display the results. So down here under display results, I'm going to say cout the sum is, and then I also want to cout the value of add result. So remember, if I'm couting actual words, those are in double quotes, and it's going to turn red in the editor here. If it's a variable and I just want to cout the value of that variable, it's just the variable name with no quotes. And of course I need a semicolon at the end. This text and this variable have to be separated by another set of double arrows. And remember, the double arrows point towards cout because this is something we're outputting, so you can mentally picture it that way. So let's test that and see what happens. Okay, so enter the first number. I'm going to enter 3, second number 5, and it says the sum is 8. Because I didn't say put a new line, this press any key to continue from the system pause is right beside. I don't like that because it makes it hard to read. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that by adding another cout And I can either add a \n, so remember the slash there is pointing backwards, and that would work, or I could add an end L. And those would both do the same thing. I'm going to add two of them, so I'll get two line spaces before my system pause. So let's see that. So 3, and I'll say 3 and 4 this time. It says the sum is 7. That's a little easier to read. My press any key to continue is down here 2 lines below. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing for subtract result, product, and division result. I'm going to have num1 minus num2 in this case. Product is going to be num1 times num2. And division result equals, I'll do num1 divided by num2. And then I also want to display out those results. Okay, so, and I think I want to add just a space between, or a line between where the user enters the numbers and where I show the results. So let's run that. Okay, so let's see, 3 and 5. We've got the sum is, the difference is, the product is, the quotient is, and they all say 8. So obviously I've made a mistake there, and you can quickly see that my mistake is when I cut and paste my lines, I changed the word here, but I forgot to change the actual variable name. So let me do that. And I have to make sure I spell it correctly. Remember, C++ is case sensitive, so you have to remember that capital letters and lowercase letters are different. Okay, and I don't want all these things to be one after each other on the same line. I'd like them to be on another line. So at the end of each of these, I'm going to add an end L. Okay. Now I will run it. Okay. First number is 3. Second number is 5. The sum is 8. The difference is -2. Product is 15. The quotient is 0. Okay, so we really didn't want that to be 0. We were expecting that to be 0.6. And the reason it was 0 was because the compiler assumed that because we were dividing one integer by another integer that we wanted the result to be in an integer, even though we were saving it in a float variable. So in order to get the compiler to give us a result that has a decimal point, we have to tell it that one of these numbers is floating point even though they're not. So what I'm going to do is type float and just put num1 in the brackets. So that's going to make num1 a float, and then the result of this whole division will be a float as well. It doesn't change num1 to a float permanently, it just in this particular instance. So let's see that run. Divided by 5, and now we get our 0.6. Okay, so now if the numbers we had started with were already floats instead of integers, we wouldn't have needed to do that. But I specifically made them integers because I also wanted to show you modulus. So let's add another int variable called mod result, or I'll just call it remainder, which is what the modulus returns. And then I need to calculate that here. So the remainder is going to be equal to num1 modulus num2. Okay, so what modulus does is performs division, but instead of returning you the result, it returns the remainder of what would be left after you divide, and you just have a whole number result. So for example, 5 divided by 2, if you were doing long division on that, you would get the answer of that to be equal to 2 with a remainder of 1. And the 1 is what the modulus would return. So let's test that. But first we need to make sure we can see the results. So I'm going to copy this line and then change it to say the remainder is, and this time I have to remember to change the variable. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to use 5 and 2, and here we have the remainder is 1, because 5 divided by 2 evenly just gives you 4 with a remainder of 1. And of course 5 divided by 2 is 2.5 when you include the decimal place. The product is 10, the difference is 3, and the sum is 7. Okay, so in all those cases I had the, if we go back up in the code, I had the user enter values for num1 and num2. Okay, but I didn't have to do that. If I knew ahead of time what I wanted num1 and num2 to be, I could just assign them their particular values. So I'm going to comment out this code where I ask the user to enter the value, and I'm just going to give num1 and 2 values, which is still initializing num1 and num2. So I could just simply type num1 equals 5 and num2 equals 3, and I could run the program. But if I'm going to do this, let's see out those values just so we can see what they are. So num1 is num1, and num2 is, and num2, and an endl, and a semicolon always. Okay, so now when I run it, it's not going to wait for the user to enter anything because there's nothing for the user to enter now. It's just going to display the results of the calculations. And there you have it. So num1 is 5, and num2 is 3. I'll just move that over so you can see num1 was 5, num2 we did say 3. Sum is 8, difference is 2, product is 15. The quotient of division is 1.66667, and the remainder would be 2. Okay, and the last thing I want to show you is ways you can change numbers. So suppose I'm starting with num2 equal to 3. I could say num2 equals the old value of num2 plus 1, and then we'd expect that num2 would actually be equal to 4. So whenever you see the variable the same on the left and the right, it's not like in math class where those two things cancel out, because remember, on the left is the variable that's getting the value, on the right is where it's getting its value from. So it always means that the new value of num2 is equal to the old value of num2 plus whatever is here. So if I run that, num1 is 5, you can see num2 is 4, and the results are appropriate to that. Okay, and this this here doesn't have to be a number, it could be another variable. So I could say it was that the new value of num2 is going to be num2 plus num1, which would be 8 in this case. So let's run that. So num1 is 5, num2 is indeed 8, sum 13, difference minus 3, etc. So the last thing I'm going to show you today is that there is a simpler way to write this equation. So instead of num2 equals num2 plus num1, I can shorten that all down to plus equals num1. So whenever you see this plus equals, it assumes that num2 is going to get the value of num2 plus whatever is here. So we still would expect num2 to get a value of 8. So if I run this, num2 is indeed still 8. Okay, so what you could do if you're not used to this format but you want to learn it, give yourself a reminder that this is the same as num2 equals num2 plus 1. And because I've made this a comment, it just gets ignored and it doesn't affect anything, but it's a reminder to us that that is the same thing as this. And I'm going to do a save all to save my program. I should have saved sooner.